The holiday season officially starts when you get that first card in the mail. Shutterfly makes it easy to add more meaning to the everyday with hundreds of holiday card designs that can be personalized in seconds with your favorite photos from this year. Select your greeting, customize the color, and even add little extras like personalized foil to make a holiday card that really shines. Enjoy 40% off with code SMILE40 at Shutterfly.com and send something meaningful this year. See site for more details.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. The holidays are here, and you know what that means? It's time to get your friends and family the gifts they deserve. Take the stress out of shopping with Amazon's great deals and low prices on a huge range of items from toys to tech and much more. Whoever you're gifting for, Amazon has great prices on everything you need this holiday season. Shop Black Friday week deals now.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Dpen Crimes. I'm Palla, and as always, I want to thank you for joining us once again. Before we dive in, I want to express my gratitude for all the listens and downloads you've given us. If you can, please give us a like, a follow, and a review. It would be amazing. Also, don't forget to follow us on social media, especially on Instagram. And for those of you looking for exclusive content, I invite you to subscribe to our Patreon. In today's episode, we're going to wrap things up. We won't be analysing more evidence or strange details, nor will we be doing any new reconstructions. Instead, we'll focus on reviewing the main hypotheses, briefly explaining the pros and cons of each. But first, let's do a quick recap of the last episode. Last time, we discussed the blood-stained footprint found on the bathroom mat. I mentioned that, in my opinion, that footprint definitely belonged to Sollecito. However, I want to clarify that it's not that simple. The defense claims it's not his, while the prosecution is convinced otherwise. The main issue is that the heel is missing, so a clear impression can't be obtained. Additionally, there's a dispute about one of the toes, which the defense says isn't pressed down, while the prosecution insists it is. Anyway, to avoid dragging this out too much, I encourage you to listen to the previous episodes for more details. Now, let's move on to the various final reconstructions, trying to put an end to this story. Otherwise, I risk making another 50 episodes discussing every little piece of evidence or detail. So, let's look at the first hypothesis. All three suspects are guilty. In the last episode, I shared my belief that all three are involved. But let me clarify. I didn't say they were guilty of murder. Rather, they're somehow implicated. This means that, in my view, they know more than they've let on. In the end, things didn't turn out too badly for them. Amanda and Raffaele spent 4 years in prison. If they were innocent, of course, that was a tough blow. But if they were guilty, not necessarily of murder, but maybe of covering for someone or keeping silent about the truth, 4 years isn't that much. Considering that Amanda, once back in the United States, became something of a celebrity, selling millions of copies of her books, I'd say she didn't do too badly at all. Let's talk about Rudy. We need to approach the situation from his perspective, setting aside everything else. The interview with Franca Leosini, the lies, the changing stories. Let's analyze Rudy's situation directly and without any beating around the bush. Imagine being in his shoes. You're in a house with the naked, mutilated body of a woman. In that room, there are your fingerprints everywhere, traces of blood, your DNA, and even epithelial cells found in the victim's vagina, indications of a sexual assault. To top it all off, there are feces in the bathroom, far from the crime scene. Now, given all this evidence against him, he only received a 16-year prison sentence. That's right, Rudy was sentenced to 16 years. And despite everything, he was released in 2023, thanks to good behaviour, the university courses he completed, and special permissions. In total, he served about 12 years in prison. Let's take a moment to think about this scenario. With all this evidence stacked against him, wouldn't we have also accepted a similar sentence? Of course, one could be innocent, and I'm not saying Rudy is guilty at all costs. However, considering the concrete evidence, not the speculations or stories of hatred or money, accepting a 16-year sentence with the chance to reduce it to 12 might seem almost like a luxury. If, back in 2007, he had been offered a chance to confess, maybe just a partial involvement, in exchange for a reduced sentence, I'm convinced Rudy would have taken it. In conclusion, Rudy's situation, while serious, might not be as dramatic as one might think, given the evidence against him. So, let's start with the first hypothesis. All three suspects are guilty. I want to reiterate that I don't mean they are guilty in the sense that all three directly committed the murder. Rather, they are all somehow implicated. Now, let's briefly touch on another hypothesis that we've already partially dismantled: Rudy as the sole perpetrator. According to this theory, Rudy would have entered the house through the window with the intention of stealing. While he was in the bathroom, he might have been surprised by Meredith when she returned home and saw him. In this version, Rudy attacks her, drags her to the bedroom, tries to rape her, and ultimately kills her. Then Rudy flees, and maybe another person was involved, or perhaps it was him who cleaned up and staged the crime scene. However, it's important to note that if Rudy had been the only guilty party, there wouldn't have been a need for a staging. In reality, there was a staging, and given that the wounds on Meredith's body suggest at least 2 assailants, the hypothesis that Rudy was solely responsible for the crime becomes difficult to support. In summary, the evidence clearly indicates that there were at least 2 attackers, making it less likely that Rudy acted alone. The only thing that really supports the lone wolf theory is the feces found at the scene. Now, let's discuss the theory in which all 3 suspects are guilty and actively participated in the crime. Again, I want to clarify that this is not the conclusion of the final sentence, which states that Rudy was certainly at the crime scene, Amanda was in the house, but not in the bedroom, and there's a possibility that Raffaele was also present. Let's explore the hypothesis that all 3 were involved. This reconstruction is complicated and presents certain challenges. In particular, the connections between Rudy and Raffaele are weak. Both claim they didn't know each other, and there's no concrete evidence that they had a motive to cover for one another. However, according to this theory, the 3 could have been together, maybe smoking and drinking. In this scenario, Rudy decides to go to the bathroom. If Raffaele and Amanda were present, they might have played different roles at the crime scene. For instance, Rudy goes to the bathroom and then comes out without flushing or cleaning up, leaving traces behind. Meanwhile, Raffaele and Amanda start engaging in some sexual activity, and in a moment of excitement, he rushes into Meredith's room, attempts to assault her, and when interrupted, Amanda and Raffaele step in, help him, and ultimately commit the murder. This theory, in which all 3 suspects would be guilty and actively participated in the crime, presents several problems. First, there are the relationships between them. Rudy and Raffaele, for example, didn't know each other well, and both claim they have no close ties. Then, there's the question of Amanda and Raffaele's involvement. If there had been an attempted assault, why would they help Rudy instead of intervening to assist Meredith? This is one of the key questions that casts doubt on their active participation. Lastly, the hypothesis that Amanda and Raffaele might have contributed to staging the crime, manipulating the scene to confuse the investigation, is complicated, especially since their involvement doesn't fully explain Rudy's behavior or the overall crime scene. In essence, this theory, while it might seem plausible in general terms, has been oversimplified and lacks crucial details. In fact, this is the theory that was considered in the first trial, but it faces many difficulties when trying to account for all the evidence and details of the case. We have 2 other theories that we haven't explored enough, but this is primarily due to the lack of concrete evidence and details to support them. Nonetheless, let's briefly review them. Venue, a listener, wrote to me saying he watched the Netflix documentary and pointed out that I haven't talked enough about the closed door. For those who haven't seen the documentary or haven't followed the previous episodes closely, I'll give a brief summary of this important detail that I haven't discussed much. Rudy, in all his statements, claims that when he fled the crime scene, he left the door open. In his reconstruction of events, Rudy says that while he was in the bathroom, 2 people came in and made a lot of noise. He tries to save Meredith, and as he escapes, he leaves the door open. In fact, we're pretty sure that Rudy did leave the door open because there were no fingerprints found on the doorknob, even though there were prints in other areas of the house. Additionally, the shoe prints he left when leaving suggest that he probably didn't go back to close the door. Sure, he could have had it open while leaving, but it's hard to imagine that Rudy deliberately closed the door behind him. However, Meredith's body was found with the door not just closed, but locked. This suggests that someone else, or the very individuals involved, returned and locked the door as part of staging the crime scene. There's another detail I mentioned in a previous episode, or maybe I just thought about it. The next morning, when Amanda enters the house, she notices the feces in the bathroom and realizes that Meredith's door is closed.
Way to eat a T. You're listening to an ad for PC Game Pass. Want new games on day one like Indiana Jones and the Great Circle? How about living out your Sims life with EA Play? We're talking high-quality PC games all for one low monthly price. We got you. Learn more at xbox.com/PC Game Pass or click the banner. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle available December 9th, 2024. Game catalog varies by region and over time. Okay, that's the ad. You can go back to doing whatever you were doing now.
This episode is brought to you by Peacock and the new original docuseries, Making Manson. In 1969, Charles Manson and his followers committed 7 brutal murders in Los Angeles that would make him infamous. Now, with access to over 100 hours of phone recordings between an incarcerated Manson and his closest confidant, a new story will unfold with shocking revelations from the man himself. Making Manson is streaming now only on Peacock.
According to reports, Amanda doesn't seem particularly scared, even when the postal police arrive and one of the officers asks her if it was normal for Meredith, her roommate, to keep her door locked. Amanda confirms that it was something usual. However, when Filomena Romanelli, the other roommate, arrives, someone, who we don't know, points out that Meredith isn't responding and that her door is locked. This detail really frightens Romanelli, who states that Meredith never locks her door, contradicting what Amanda had said. Worried, Romanelli asks the 2 postal police officers to force the door open. The officers ask if she agrees, as she, being the responsible person in the house, must authorize the action to avoid any potential issues regarding damages. Romanelli consents, and the officers break down the door, discovering Meredith's body inside. This detail suggests that Amanda wasn't necessarily trying to delay the discovery of the body, but there's something odd about her demeanor. Moreover, the key to Meredith's room was never found. We know for certain that someone locked the door, and we know that Rudy wasn't responsible for this, which strengthens the hypothesis that there was more than one guilty party, and that events unfolded at least in 2 different moments. In fact, I can tell you that there were probably 3, if not 4, distinct moments throughout this story. For example, we know that Meredith had gone to a friend's house to watch a movie. The detailed reconstruction, based on a very accurate map, shows that Meredith was at her friend's house watching the movie The Notebook, in Spanish Diario de una Pasión, a film by Nicholas Sparks. Meredith was with 2 friends, and they were eating pizza and ice cream together. At 9 p.m., Meredith and one of the friends, who I believe is named Parson, if I remember correctly, returned home, but each went back to their own apartment. So, we have some key moments that we need to consider. Meredith's return. Meredith comes home after spending the night with her friends. Rudy using the bathroom. At some point, Rudy is in Meredith's house using the bathroom while she's still alive. The murder. The moment when Meredith is killed. The staging. The moment when the crime scene is manipulated. Now we need to place the different characters within these key moments, keeping in mind that not all characters necessarily participated in every moment. It's essential to analyze each moment to understand who was present and what role they might have played in this sequence of events. As with any murder, there's always the possibility that the true culprits were never found or even investigated. In other words, the real perpetrators of the crime could have committed the murder without leaving any traces, and thus they may never have been discovered. This scenario, while difficult to imagine, becomes complicated by the fact that Rudy was present in the house and hasn't provided clear indications that lead us in any other direction. One of the theories I've come across online, though it's not very solid, suggests that Rudy might have had an accomplice, a friend who helped him. The idea is that Rudy doesn't want to accuse this friend, perhaps because they're very close. After being arrested, Rudy might have accepted his 16-year prison sentence, knowing that he had avoided a harsher punishment. In this version, the murder would have been committed by Rudy and this friend, but there are some inconsistencies. For instance, it's unclear how both of them could have entered and exited without leaving traces, and how one or both of them could have returned later to stage the crime scene. This takes us into almost a science fiction territory. It wouldn't make sense because the staging, along with the discovery of the feces, are the two discordant points. You see, finding a young woman naked in her room, having been slashed, while not something that happens every day, is still a textbook crime scene. But the feces in a distant bathroom, without any blood, and the manipulation of the scene are the elements that make this case unique. This kind of staging is typically carried out by someone who has a close relationship with the house and wants to divert suspicion onto an external intruder. Staging usually occurs in cases where the murder is committed by someone living with the victim. It's rare for strangers to do it. Normally, it happens when the crime is perpetrated by family members or close individuals, like husbands, wives, children, or parents, who try to make it look like the murder was the work of an outsider. Now, let's take a look at today's comments. Lucia mentions that Rudy might have incriminated himself by adding made-up details to his story, like claiming he first saw one person, then two, from the window. This, according to Lucia, suggests that Rudy was trying to pin the blame on someone else. We discussed this yesterday. Pietro commented that he watched the video and noticed that the house is much smaller than he imagined. This detail, as Pietro points out, nearly dismantles Rudy's theories. In fact, if the house is that small, Rudy wouldn't have been able to miss seeing the people he claims passed over him. So, we begin with an overview of the theories. The idea that Rudy could have been alone doesn't hold up because while it's difficult, it's not impossible. The initial ruling states that all three were involved, though the motive seems weak and the murder weapon is missing. However, it's a possibility we can't completely rule out. We've explained why the theory of unknown intruders is hard to sustain, especially due to the staging. Now, we arrive at an important point. There's a theory that's exclusively mine. It doesn't explain everything, and it doesn't present concrete evidence, but it's a possibility to consider. In my opinion, Raffaele Sollecito might not be directly involved in the murder. He could have a role in the staging, though I have doubts about this aspect. However, I believe Sollecito knows more than he has declared. So, in Raffaele Sollecito's second interrogation, the famous one from November 5th that we talked about, he claims that Amanda forced him to say false things. Sollecito insists that Amanda had gone out with her friends and returned home around 1 a.m. In this story, I've always excluded the witnesses. There are witnesses that I believe are completely unreliable, but there are two witnesses I consider credible. The first is a woman who lives in the buildings across from the house where the murder took place. The house is located on a cliff with a forest behind it. Around 11:30, she went to the bathroom, heard a terrifying scream, and shortly after heard people fleeing. She stated that she heard more than one person, but not more than two. The second reliable witness is a Polish student who lives across from Sollecito's house. She claims to have seen Amanda and Raffaele return home around 6 a.m. and then saw Amanda leave alone later while Sollecito stayed inside. So, even though I'm not too fond of the idea, I believe that Sollecito is not guilty of the murder, mainly because he doesn't seem to have a motive. He's not sincere, but there's no obvious motive for him. Let me explain my theory, and then we'll read yours. Amanda and Sollecito had been together for about 5 or 6 days, and it seems that despite the relationship, there was some friction between them because Amanda was tired of staying in and wanted to go out and do something. In fact, from Amanda's book, which I haven't read in full, I've only read some excerpts, it can be inferred that she didn't have a close relationship with Rudy, even though she had seen him at the boys' house and exchanged a few words at the bar. But there's something that made me think. She writes, I knew that Rudy had told the guys and had shown a little interest in me, meaning he was attracted to me. This made me consider a possible connection. Let's assume, as a theory, and every theory has its limits, that Amanda and Rudy met at Piazza Grimana. Amanda had been at Sollecito's house and might have played a bit naive, saying, what if we play a prank on Meredith, with whom she didn't have a good relationship? It's not a relationship that justifies murder, but it wasn't good. Amanda used to bring guys home and wasn't very clean. They were opposites, but not enough to justify a crime. An interesting detail is that Amanda had already pulled a similar prank on a friend in the past, pretending to rob her to scare her. Imagine that after meeting Rudy in the square, Amanda proposes to play a prank on Meredith, taking advantage of the fact that Meredith isn't home. This may not make much sense at first, but to a 20-year-old guy who had broken into a kindergarten the day before and isn't very lucid, the girl he likes comes up and makes this proposal. Plus, there's the possibility of being alone at home, making it an intriguing situation. But weren't there witnesses in that square? Asks Lucia, who's listening to us. No, because at that time, around 8:30 p.m., there was no one there. And keep in mind that Piazza Grimana is a tiny square. It's not the Piazza del Duomo, and it was dark, so nobody saw them. So no, there are no witnesses. This explains how he enters the house. And maybe while they're waiting, because we know Meredith arrives after 9 p.m., according to me, around 9:15 or 9:30. He's been there for a while and starts feeling a bit uneasy and goes to the bathroom. So, let's add that Rudy entered with Knox and didn't have to break anything. He's in the bathroom while waiting for Meredith. When Meredith arrives, he's already in the bathroom. So, he suddenly comes out because otherwise, the prank wouldn't work. I imagine a prank where Rudy doesn't envision knives or other weapons, especially since they're not wearing masks, but he would threaten with a knife because then she would report him. Let's say the prank goes awry. I know I'm making some pretty outlandish assumptions, but something must explain this. The prank turns into an attempted rape, and a knife appears, which would explain the wounds on the body near the neck, as if someone, perhaps Amanda with a shaky hand, injured her. The situation spirals out of control. She defends herself against the attempted rape, but we know Rudy inserts a finger into the vaginal canal, but nothing more. And probably, in my reconstruction, there's a stab wound. It doesn't take much to cut a vital artery. Arteries swell significantly in a state of agitation. The blade is very sharp, and it doesn't take much to cause a disaster and result in a fatal wound. This could make sense because there are actually 2 stab wounds. Let's say that's what happened. Let's continue with the theory. The scene could turn chaotic. They realize what they've done and try to stop the bleeding. But when they understand the severity of the situation, they flee, each in their own direction. Goodbye. Let's imagine Amanda, covered in blood and shaken, returns to Sollecito's house. She explains to him that the prank with Rudy went wrong and that Meredith is seriously injured. Remember, Sollecito is in love, etc. If we add the fact that she left annoyed because they never went out together and was a bit irritated, when she returns home and finds him covered in blood, she says, "I was pulling a prank, and it went wrong." He tries to calm her down. They might also have gone to check if Meredith was still alive and then returned a second time to stage the scene and divert suspicion. In this reconstruction, Amanda convinces Sollecito to clean up the scene and set it up. In this scenario, Amanda could have said to Sollecito, "There was a peron of color with me. Let's make it look like it's his fault," referring to Rudy, who has fled. Meanwhile, Rudy has escaped, which shows that generally no innocent person runs away. Why don't they accuse each other, Amanda and Rudy? This is crucial because it wouldn't make sense to blame each other in that situation. Let me explain why. Rudy distances himself from the process. His lawyers probably advise him to take this path. No one would believe in a prank gone wrong because it wouldn't make sense. But to me, it does make sense. When Rudy realizes that being accused of complicity in the murder Instead of being directly convicted of murder could result in a less severe sentence, he decides to stay silent. He knows that despite the evidence against him, in no trial and no place in the world could he be completely exonerated. For him, remaining silent is the best option. Then, it's clear that he starts to accuse Amanda and the others. This would also explain his statements because Rudy can't tell the truth. Initially, he doesn't accuse Amanda, which is interesting. Later, when he receives a 30-year sentence and the other two receive less time because they have better lawyers and the scientific evidence isn't as direct against them, only then does he begin to talk about Amanda and Sollecito. In his first communication via Skype with a friend, he clearly states that Amanda has nothing to do with it. If he had directly accused Amanda, she could have responded that Rudy was involved, collaborating with her. And I'll tell you two more things that, for me, are interesting and would strengthen this theory. Amanda accuses Lumumba, who is black, perhaps because there was a black person with her, trying to divert attention and buy time. There's another element. On the night of the 5th, Amanda says, "I was with Lumumba at home." Even though we know it wasn't him, she could have been with Rudy. Then, Amanda steps back from the scene and says she was in the kitchen, only hearing a very loud scream. That scream, which she says seemed like a dream, we know really happened because of the witness from the building across. If Amanda hadn't actually heard that scream, she couldn't have imagined it. This suggests she might have been present, and the theory that she and Rudy were alone could explain some details. If we replace Lumumba with Rudy in her account, many things fit together. She shades herself a bit, saying she heard the scream from the kitchen and was covering her ears because she was scared. But what if she participated more? Many elements could align. After the first instance conviction, it wouldn't make sense for Amanda to accuse Rudy because that would mean a sure confession and definitively incriminate her. She wouldn't have spared Sollecito, whom, as we know, she didn't care much about. The only complex aspect to explain is Sollecito's role. With a 25-year sentence, he could have claimed he was dragged into the situation, influenced by love, and made a big mistake. While it's hard to imagine, it's not impossible that he was in love and wanted to protect Amanda. This would explain why Sollecito, when talking about the prints, was sure about which ones weren't his. He knew where he had been and where he had cleaned. In my opinion, they didn't perform a specific cleanup, but rather a general cleaning of the hallway, the bathroom, and other areas. This also explains why the feces weren't removed, even after the attempt at staging, because it's evidence of Rudy's presence in the house. So, this is a theory I propose for you to reflect on until the next episode. In the following episode, we'll discuss it in detail. Send me all your theories, and then I'll read and discuss them in the final episode. Today, I also saw a photo of a hooded person heading toward Amanda's house around the time she might have returned alone, without Sollecito. Amanda, of course, denies it was her, but I promise you the photo exists, and it could be interesting. The theory I'm proposing connects some recent details and seems to explain several elements of the case. It certainly has weaknesses, such as the possibility that Sollecito might have simply admitted to making a mistake, claiming he covered up the crime out of love for Amanda. Alternatively, Amanda could have tried to negotiate a better deal by telling the truth to receive a lighter sentence. However, even with a confession, the penalty wouldn't have been drastically reduced since it's a murder charge. Clearly, no reconstruction manages to explain everything completely. I've examined a lot of information about this case, and this theory seems to fit best with the facts. It's obvious there must have been something more behind it. It's not possible for two people to meet in a square and decide to scare a roommate without a serious motive. I'm just making a hypothesis, of course. Zapp has also said that lawyers play a crucial role. If the evidence doesn't lead anywhere, Sollecito's lawyer might have advised him to stay silent. Moreover, starting from the appeal, Sollecito had the best lawyer in Italy, Attorney Buongiorno. This could have influenced the defense strategy. It's also true that Sollecito spent 4 years in prison, 6 months of which were in isolation, which can lead to deep reflections about his role and the decisions made. I appreciate all your theories. The next episode will be the last of the series, closing the case of Meredith Kercher. Thank you all, and have a good night.